The message arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. It came through the deep space relay that the aliens had placed just beyond Mars, the only piece of technology they had ever given to Earth. For 5 years that relay had been silent except for short, cold warnings whenever a human ship drifted too close to the quarantine boundary, but on that Tuesday morning it lit up with a transmission that was received by every government, every military base, and every research station on the planet at the same time. The message was simple. Earth was to send 3 representatives to the Grand Council chamber on the alien capital world called Ethos Prime. These 3 would speak for all of humanity. They would argue for humanity's right to join the Galactic Union, the vast alliance of over 800 species that controlled the known galaxy. If the Council found humanity worthy, they would be welcomed. If they did not, Earth would remain locked inside its quarantine zone forever, or worse, the message said further measures would be taken. Everyone on Earth understood what further measures meant. The world erupted into chaos. Governments held emergency sessions. Military leaders demanded that Earth prepare for war. Protesters filled the streets of every major city, some begging for peace and some screaming for defiance. Across the planet, billions of people looked up at the sky and felt for the first time in their lives truly small. The United Earth Coalition, when the fragile government that had been formed after first contact 5 years ago, gathered in Geneva to make the most important decision in human history. They argued for 11 days. Some wanted to send 100 diplomats. Some wanted to send warships. Some wanted to send nothing at all and seal the planet shut. In the end, they chose to send 3 people, just 3. The decision was made by director Amara Singh, and it nearly cost her career. Half the coalition called her insane. The other half called her a traitor. She stood at the podium and said only this: they want to see what humanity is. 3 people chosen well will show them more than any army ever could. The first name on the list was Commander Idris Akefer. They found him on Mars at a military outpost, buried in the red dust of Val Marinaries. Money. He had been stationed there for 2 years training the first generation of Earth's off-world soldiers. It was quiet work, and he preferred it that way. Akefer was not a man who enjoyed attention. He was 46 years old, built like something that had been carved from stone and left out in the rain. His face carried scars from 3 wars, conflicts that most people on Earth had already forgotten. His eyes were steady and dark, and gave away nothing. When the shuttle landed and the coalition officer handed him the briefing file, Akefer read it in silence. He asked no questions. He packed a single bag, said goodbye to his soldiers, and walked onto the shuttle without looking back. On the flight to Earth, the officer tried to make conversation. She asked him if he was nervous about meeting aliens for the first time. Akefer looked out the window at the black emptiness of space and said, "I've met worse." The second name was Ambassador Lena Vasquez. They found her in S. Paulo in the middle of a hostage crisis. A man with a gun and a broken heart had taken 11 people inside a bank, and for the past 9 hours, Vasquez had been the only voice on the phone keeping him calm. She was 51 with silver-streaked hair pulled back tight, and a face that could shift from warm kindness to cold steel in the space of a single breath. She had spent 23 years in diplomacy and crisis negotiation, and she had learned something that most people never understood. Every conflict in the universe was really about pain. Find the pain and you could find the way out. She talked the gunman down at 3:47. In the morning, he came out crying and she held the door for him. Then she sat on the curb, opened the briefing file that had been waiting on her phone for 6 hours and read it twice. By the time the coalition shuttle arrived, she was already packed on the ride to Geneva. She read everything that humanity had ever recorded about the Galactic Union. Every intercepted transmission, every analysis, every guess and theory. Most of it was useless. The aliens had been careful to reveal almost nothing about their politics or culture, but Vasquez noticed something that others had missed. The message from the council did not say, "We invite you." It said, "You are summoned." That single word told her everything she needed to know about how the Union saw humanity. They were not being welcomed, they were being judged. The third name was Dr. Kao Murakami. They found him in Kyoto, in a basement laboratory beneath the university where he officially taught theoretical physics. Unofficially, he had not taught a class in 2 years. He had been down in that basement surrounded by whiteboards, covered in equations, empty coffee cups, and pieces of alien technology that were not supposed to exist. 5 years ago, when an alien probe had crashed in the Pacific Ocean, the coalition had recovered fragments of its engine before the Union's cleanup crew arrived. Those fragments had been sent to the world's best physicists. Most of them had given up within months. The technology was centuries beyond human understanding. But Murakami had not given up. He never gave up on anything. That was both his greatest strength and the thing that worried the people who knew him. He was 38, thin, quiet ham, and possessed the kind of mind that saw patterns in places where others saw only noise. He spoke 4 languages but preferred silence. When the coalition officer arrived in his basement and told him he had been selected, Murakami looked up from his equations and blinked as if he had forgotten what sunlight looked like. "Selected for what?" he asked. They explained. He listened. Then he looked back at his whiteboards and said, "I need to bring my notes." "Your notes are classified, doctor." "Then declassify them, because what I found is going to change everything, and if I'm going to stand in front of the galaxy, I'd rather not do it empty-handed." The coalition spent 3 days arguing about his request. In the end, they gave him a secure data pad with everything on it, and what they did not know, what no one knew, was that Murakami had already memorized every equation. The data pad was a backup. His mind was the original. The 3 of them met for the first time aboard the UEC ship Perseverance, a fast cruiser that had been hastily refitted for the journey. It was the finest ship Earth had ever built, and compared to the alien vessels they had seen in intercepted images, it looked like a rowboat next to an aircraft carrier. Akefer arrived first. He chose a seat in the briefing room and sat in it like a man who had learned to sleep anywhere and trust nothing. Vasquez arrived next, shook his hand firmly, studied his face for 3 seconds, and sat across from him. Murakami arrived last, carrying a bag of notebooks that he placed on the table like they were made of glass. For a long moment no one spoke, and then Vasquez said, "So the 3 of us are supposed to save the human race." "That's the idea." said Akafor, and how do you two feel? About that, Akafor shrugged. I've had worse orders. Murakami looked up from the notebook he had already opened. I feel like we should have been given more time to prepare. Vasquez smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had walked into 100 rooms where the odds were stacked against her and walked out of every single one. Time is a luxury. We'll work with what we have. They spent the first 2 days of the journey arguing, not fighting. Arguing. There is a difference. Akafor wanted a clear plan with contingencies for violence. Vasquez wanted flexibility and room to read the room. Murakami wanted them both to understand the science, one because he believed what he had discovered would be the key to everything. They disagreed on almost every point. They challenged each other. They frustrated each other, and slowly, without any of them saying it out loud, they began to respect each other. On the third day, the Perseverance crossed the quarantine boundary. The moment it did, the ship's sensors screamed to life. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, shaking. Contacts, multiple contacts everywhere. The three of them rushed to the observation deck and looked out into space, and what they saw stole the breath from their lungs. Ships, hundreds of them, thousands, warships of every shape and size, arranged in vast formations that stretched across the void like a wall of steel and light. Some were as small as fighters, some were larger than cities. Oh, they hung in the darkness, silent and watching, their weapon systems glowing faintly, like the eyes of predators in the night. The entire might of the Galactic Union's border fleet assembled to escort 3 humans on a ship made of tin and hope. Vasquez stared at the armada and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Akafor studied the formations with a soldier's eye and began counting weapon signatures. Murakami pressed his hand against the glass and whispered something to himself that the others did not hear. They're afraid of us. Vasquez said quietly, look at this. This isn't an escort. This is a show of force. They're afraid and they want us to know it. Good, said Akafor. Murakami turned away from the window. His face was calm, but his eyes were burning with something that looked like the beginning of a fire. Wouldn't it? They should be, he said. The Perseverance flew on, a tiny spark of light surrounded by the darkness of 1,000 alien warships, carrying 3 fragile human beings toward a meeting that would decide the fate of their entire species. Behind them, Earth watched and waited and held its breath. Ahead of them, the galaxy had no idea what was coming. Ethos Prime was not a planet, it was a statement. It hung in the void like a second sun, station the size of a small moon, built from metals that human science had no names for, wrapped in rings of light that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. It was 4,000 years old, and it had been designed for one purpose: to make every species that saw it for the first time feel utterly insignificant. It worked. The Perseverance approached the docking ring in silence, which the 3 humans stood at the observation deck and said nothing. There was nothing to say. They had studied images and intercepted data for years, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of it. Ethos Prime was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and it made Earth's greatest cities look like sandcastles built by children. Akafor was the first to speak. That's a lot of metal. Vasquez almost laughed. Almost. That's one way to put it. Murakami simply stared, and the others could see his mind working behind his eyes pulling the station apart, piece by piece, trying to understand how it was built. The docking procedure took 2 hours. Their ship was scanned 17 times by systems that the Perseverance's computers could not even identify. When the airlock finally opened, a wave of air rolled into the ship, warm, clean, and carrying a faint scent that none of them could place. It smelled like flowers and lightning and something ancient. Their escort was waiting on the other side. 6 soldiers of the Veldrai hegemony stood in perfect formation, each one nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark green scales that shimmered under the station's light. Their eyes were yellow and slitted, and they looked at the 3 humans the way a person might look at insects that had crawled onto a dinner table. The lead soldier spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. The translator implant behind Vasquez's ear turned it into flat, emotionless English. You will follow. You will not speak. You will not touch anything. You will not deviate from the path. Vasquez smiled her diplomatic smile. Thank you for the warm welcome. The soldier did not respond, yet they were led through corridors so vast that clouds formed near the ceiling. The walls were lined with holographic displays showing the symbols and histories of hundreds of species, each one a member of the Galactic Union. Akepper noticed that the displays were arranged by seniority, with the oldest species at the top. There was no display for humanity. There was no space for one either. They walked for nearly an hour before they reached the Grand Council chamber, and when the doors opened, all 3 of them stopped. The chamber was a cathedral. No, it was bigger than any cathedral ever built. It was a sphere, half a mile across, with seats carved into every surface, walls, ceiling, floor, each section designed for the specific biology of its species. Some seats were filled with water, some were suspended in webs of energy, some were simply vast open spaces where creatures too large for chairs could stand. Light came from everywhere and nowhere, shifting in colors that human eyes could barely process, and in every seat, on every surface, alien faces turned to look at the 3 small figures standing in the entrance. 800 species, thousands of representatives, 4,000 years of galactic civilization, all assembled in one room, all looking at them. Vasquez felt her heart hammering in her chest. She controlled her breathing, kept her face calm, and walked forward. Beside her, Akepper moved with the steady, measured pace of a soldier on a mission. Murakami followed, his eyes darting everywhere, cataloging everything. They were led to a small platform at the center of the chamber, a circle of light no larger than a living room. It was positioned at the lowest point of the sphere, which meant that every single alien in the room was looking down at them. Vasquez understood immediately. The platform was designed to make them feel like prisoners on trial, because that was exactly what they were. A voice filled the chamber. It was deep and resonant, amplified by technology that made it seem to come from the walls themselves. The council recognizes the representatives of the species designated human from the quarantine world designated Earth. The voice belonged to High Arbiter Zalkith, and when the 3 humans looked up, they saw him for the first time. He sat on a raised throne at the highest point of the chamber, directly above them. He was Dratha, the same reptilian species as their escort, but older, larger, weighing, wrapped in robes that seemed to be made from woven light. His scales were pale, almost white, the color of a predator that had outlived every challenger. His yellow eyes were ancient and cold and utterly without mercy. You stand before the Galactic Union, Joel. Keth continued, your species is young. Your civilization is primitive. World is violent. You have been quarantined for the safety of all member species, and you have been summoned here to present your case for inclusion. This is not a request. This is a trial. His eyes found Vasquez, and something in them sharpened. You will face 3 trials. Each one will test a different quality that the Union requires of its members. Failure in any trial result in the denial of your petition. Do you understand? Vasquez stepped forward. We understand, Emina, and we accept. You were not given the option to refuse. I know, Vasquez said. I accept it anyway. There's a difference. Ripple went through the chamber. Thousands of alien eyes shifted. Something had changed in the air. Something small but real. Zolkith stared at her for a long moment, then continued, the first trial is the trial of might. It will test your species' ability to survive, to endure, and to fight. A single champion must be chosen from among you. Akepper stepped forward. Without hesitation, he did not look at the others for permission. He did not need to. This was his purpose, and they all knew it. The second trial is the trial of voice. It will test your species' ability to communicate, to persuade, and to understand. A single speaker must be chosen. Vasquez gave a small nod. She had been preparing for this her entire life, even before she knew it existed. The third trial is the trial of mind. It will test your species' intellectual capacity and its ability to contribute to the advancement of galactic knowledge. A single thinker must be chosen. Murakami pushed his glasses up his nose and said nothing. He did not need to. The trials will begin tomorrow, Joketh announced. You will be confined to your quarters until then. The council will observe and judge. That is all. The platform beneath them dimmed, and the escort appeared again to lead them away. But before they left, something happened that none of them had expected. A voice rose from the lower tiers of the chamber, soft, musical, and rippling with harmonics that the human ear could barely catch. A creature made of light and flowing water stepped forward from its section. It was Salary, a species they had only read about in intercepted files. Its body was translucent, bioluminescent, glowing with soft blues and greens, and it looked at the 3 humans with something that might have been kindness. I wish to formally note, the Salary representative said, that the species designated human has traveled farther than any petitioning species in council history to stand before us. I wish them well in their trials. The chamber went silent. Joel Keth's eyes narrowed. The Salary representative returned to its seat as if nothing had happened. Vasquez made a mental note of its face. She would need that ally later. Their quarters were a sealed suite near the outer ring of the station, comfortable by human standards, but clearly a containment unit. The doors locked behind them. The windows showed only stars. The 3 of them sat around a small table and looked at each other. And for the first time, the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on them like gravity. The trials are rigged, Vasquez said. It was not a question. Akepper nodded. The arena set up the time limits the way Zolkith described them. This isn't a fair evaluation. It's a performance. They've already decided we're going to fail. Every species that has failed these trials, Vasquez continued, was either absorbed into a more powerful member species stripped of its independence, or destroyed. Murakami finished. He had been reading the data pad. I found references in the intercepted archives. At least 12 species in the last 1,000 years have been eliminated after failing. The trials, the Union calls it protective removal. They frame it as defense. It's not, it's control. Then we don't fail. Akepper said it's not that simple. They'll change the rules if they need to. The trial of might won't be a fair fight. It never is. Akepper looked at him steadily. I didn't say it would be fair. I said we don't fail. Vasquez leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She was thinking. The others had learned to recognize this. When Vasquez went quiet, she was working through possibilities faster than most people could speak. We're thinking about this wrong, she said finally. We're treating this like we need to pass their test, but that's not what we really need to do. What do we need to do? Murakami asked. Vasquez opened her eyes. We need to scare them, not with violence, not with threats. We need to show them something they've never seen before, something they can't categorize, can't predict, can't control. Every species that has stood on that platform before us tried to prove that they were good enough for the Union. We need to prove that the Union isn't ready for us. Akepper studied her face. That's a dangerous game. It's the only game that keeps us alive. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Murakami reached into his bag and pulled out a notebook. He opened it to a page covered in equations so dense they look like art, and he placed it on the table between them. She's right, he said softly. And I have something that's going to make the danger very real. He told them what he had found, what he had really found in those fragments of alien technology. He told them about the flaw in the Union's faster-than-light equations, and he told them what he believed it meant. When he was finished, Akepper's face was unreadable, and Vasquez's hands were shaking. If you're right, Vasquez whispered, this changes everything. I am right. Then God help us all, said Akepper, because they're going to try to kill us the moment you open your mouth. Murakami closed the notebook. Then I suppose, he said quietly, we had better make sure the first 2 trials go well. Outside their window, the stars of the galaxy turned slowly in the dark, ancient and indifferent. Somewhere in the station, the Veldre High Arbiter was meeting with his advisors. I confident that tomorrow would unfold as it always had, with the newcomers broken and obedient. He had judged 1,000 species across 1,000 years. He had never judged humans, and by the time he understood what that meant, it would already be too late. The trial of might began at dawn, or what passed for dawn on Ith's Prime, when the station's artificial sun panels shifted from black to gold, and light flooded through every corridor like a tide. They came for Opera first. 4 Velray soldiers, fully armored, escorted him from the quarters without a word. Vasquez caught his arm as he passed. Come back, she said. That's the plan, he replied. He was taken to a massive arena built into the belly of the station. It was a coliseum shaped like a bowl, a mile wide, with seating that rose in rings all the way to the distant ceiling, and every seat was filled. Thousands of alien faces watched from every direction, some with eyes, some with sensory organs that humans had no names for, holographic screens floated above the arena floor, broadcasting the event to every world in the Galactic Union. HFY stood at the center of the arena floor and looked around. The floor beneath him was bare metal. The air smelled like ozone. Above him, in the highest box, High Arbiter Zalkith sat in his throne and looked down like a god watching an ant. The trial of might, Joel Keth announced, his voice filling the arena, is not a simple test of strength. It is a test of survival. The arena will present the candidate with a series of environments drawn from the most hostile worlds in the known galaxy. The candidate must survive. There is no time limit. There is no mercy. Ari, there is only endurance. The floor beneath HFY's feet began to change. The first environment was heat. The metal floor turned red, then white. The temperature climbed past anything a human body was designed to handle. The air shimmered and burned. In the stands, alien species that lived on frozen worlds shuddered, just watching. Sensors projected HFY's vital signs on the floating screens: his heart rate, his body temperature, his stress levels. The audience watched his body do something that most of them had never seen before. He sweated. It seems like such a small thing, but to the hundreds of species watching, it was deeply unsettling. Water poured from his skin, cooling his body through evaporation. His biology was actively fighting the environment, adapting in real time to burning through energy reserves to keep his core temperature stable. The Irani collective, the vast insectoid hive mind that occupied an entire section of the arena, sent a flurry of chemical signals among its members. Their analysis was immediate and disturbing. This creature's body was designed for endurance on a level they had never cataloged. The heat lasted for 40 minutes. HFY survived by stripping down to his undershirt, keeping himself moving to avoid the hottest surfaces, and controlling his breathing with a discipline that came from years of training in places that most people pretended did not exist. The second environment was cold. The arena shifted. In seconds, the heat vanished and was replaced by a frozen wasteland. Ice formed on the metal floor. Temperature dropped to 60 below zero. HFY's breath came in white clouds. Frost formed on his skin. He did not stop moving. He tore strips from his clothing and wrapped them around his hands and feet. He found debris from the arena's machinery and built a crude shelter against the wind that now howled across the floor. His body shivered violently, another biological response that fascinated and horrified the alien audience. His muscles were generating heat through involuntary movement. He was a machine that refused to shut down. The cold lasted for an hour. By the end of it, HFY's lips were blue and his fingers were numb, but he was still standing. Then came the toxic atmosphere, a yellow fog that rolled across the arena, filled with chemicals that would dissolve the lungs of most carbon-based life forms. HFY ripped fabric from his clothing, wet it with the condensation from the cold phase, and held it over his mouth and nose. It was crude. It barely worked, but it worked enough. His eyes streamed with tears and every breath felt like fire, but he stayed on his feet. Then came the crushing gravity, the arena's gravity. Generators increased the pull to 3 times Earth normal. HFY's knees buckled, his spine compressed. Every step felt like carrying another person on his back. He gritted his teeth until they creaked, lowered his center of Gravity and kept moving, the alien. Audience had gone very quiet, and then they released the beast. It came through a gate at the far end of the arena. Keth Varen, a bioengineered war creature. From the Veldry hegemony's private breeding pits, it was 12 ft tall at the shoulder. It's covered in armored plates, the color of dried blood, with 6 limbs, and a head full of teeth that could crush a stone. It was designed for one purpose: killing. It saw charged. Any other species in the Union's history would have tried to run or tried to fight with brute force. Akepper did neither. He watched the creature come, studied how it moved, and at the last possible moment he stepped sideways. The beast thundered past him, its claws tearing sparks from the metal floor. It turned, it charged again. Akepper dodged. He was not trying to fight it. He was studying it. On the third charge, he saw what he needed. The beast favored its right side. Its fourth limb had a slight hesitation, an old injury maybe, or a flaw in its engineering. Akepper began to move in a pattern, always circling to the creature's weak side, always forcing it to turn, always staying just out of reach. The minutes turned into hours. The beast grew frustrated, then tired, then confused. It had never fought prey that would not stand still and die. Akepper kept moving, walking in long, steady circles, never stopping, never hurrying. His body was built for this. 100,000 years of evolution on the plains of Africa had given his species a gift that no other creature in the galaxy possessed: the ability to run prey into the ground through sheer, relentless, unending persistence. The Kith Varen collapsed. After 4 hours, it lay on the arena floor, its massive chest heaving, its legs trembling, completely spent. It had been broken not by violence but by patience. Akepper walked over to it. Slowly, his body was battered, his hands were cracked and bleeding, and every muscle screamed. The arena was silent. 10,000 alien beings holding their breath. Akepper knelt beside the beast. He reached out and placed his hand on its head gently, the way a man might comfort a tired dog. Then he pulled a piece of cloth from his pocket, soaked it with water from his canteen, the last of his water, and held it to the creature's mouth. The beast drank in the stand. Something broke. The silence was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of shock. In 4,000 years of the trial of might across hundreds of species, no one had ever shown mercy to a defeated opponent. The concept did not exist. You won or you lost, you killed or you died. That was the way of the galaxy. This human had won, and then he had knelt in the dust and given his water to the thing that had been sent to kill him. High Arbiter Joel Keth leaned forward. His throne, his yellow eyes were very still. The trial of voice came next, and it belonged to Vasquez. She was placed in a small chamber adjoining the main council room. 2 alien delegations sat on opposite sides of a long table. The Tereshi, a species of tall, thin beings with crystalline skin, and the Van, stocky and stone-like, with deep voices that rumbled like earthquakes. They had been locked in a territorial dispute for 300 years over a mineral-rich system that sat between their borders. The council had tried to mediate dozens of times and failed. Vasquez was given 1 hour to find a resolution. She did not start by talking about territory, and she did not start by talking about resources or borders or law. She looked at the Teshi delegation leader and said, You lost a colony ship in that system, didn't you? 200 years ago, the wreckage is still there. The Torshi froze. The information was not classified, but no one had ever brought it up in negotiations. It was irrelevant to the legal dispute. Vasquez continued, and you, she said, turning to the Vanok leader, your species built a memorial on the third moon of that system for the soldiers who died in your civil war. You visited every cycle. The Vanok leader's stone face shifted, a tiny movement that Vasquez caught, and the rest of the room missed. This isn't about minerals, Vasquez said softly. You both know the system isn't worth fighting over. Economically, Noma the Teshi have 3 richer mining operations in neighboring sectors. The Van have access to the same minerals through their trade agreements. This dispute has continued for 3 centuries because that system means something to both of you. It's sacred ground, and neither of you has ever been able to say that, because in this council, admitting that you care about something gives your enemies a weapon. The room went quiet. Vasquez leaned forward. I'm human. On our world, we fought wars that lasted centuries over land that wasn't worth a single life, and every time when we finally stopped fighting, we discovered that the real wound wasn't about the land at all. It was about grief. It was about being seen. It was about someone saying, I understand why this matters to you. She looked at both delegations in turn. So I'm saying it now. This matters to both of you, and you both have the right to grieve. She proposed a shared stewardship, joint governance of the system with protected status for both the Terrace wreckage site and the Vanok memorial. Not a compromise, a recognition. The Terrace delegation leader was silent for a long time. Then it spoke in a voice like wind chimes in a storm. No mediator has ever asked us why we cared. The agreement was signed in 40 minutes. When Vasquez returned to the council chamber, she did not take her seat on the platform. Instead, she looked up at the thousands of alien faces watching her and spoke. You want to know what humanity is? We're the species that breaks. We shatter ourselves with wars and hatred and cruelty that would make most of you sick. We've committed atrocities against our own kind that I will not describe in this chamber, because they would give you nightmares. We are capable of extraordinary evil. She paused. And we survive it every time. We crawl out of the wreckage. We bury our dead, and we build again. Not because we're strong, because we refuse to stop. You've tested hundreds of species in this chamber. How many of them destroyed themselves 3 times over before they even reached the stars and still came back? How many of them carry the scars of their own worst impulses and wear them openly without shame as proof that they can change? She did not beg. She did not ask for acceptance. She stood on that platform and told the most powerful civilization in the galaxy that humanity was not applying for membership. Humanity was offering an alliance when in the Union should think carefully about whether it was strong enough to accept. The trial of mind was last, and it was Murakami's. He was brought to a research chamber and seated before a holographic display showing the most complex mathematical problem the Union had ever produced. The Kyle-Dunn paradox, a cascading error, the fundamental equations that govern faster than light travel through the Union's hyperlane network. For 300 years, the greatest scientific minds of 800 species had failed to solve it. Ships occasionally vanished in hyperspace. Entire trade routes had to be abandoned. The problem was considered unsolvable. Murakami studied the equations. He studied them for 10 minutes, his eyes moving across the holographic symbols with the calm focus of a man reading a familiar book. Then he laughed. It was a quiet laugh, almost sad, and it echoed in the silent chamber like a stone dropped in still water. The council observers shifted uncomfortably. This isn't a paradox, Murakami said. It's a lock. He stood and began manipulating the holographic display, pulling equations apart and rearranging them with his bare hands. As he worked, he spoke. 300 years ago, someone altered these equations. They introduced an error, not a random one, but a precise, deliberate modification that limits the efficiency of your FTL travel. Your hyperlane network works, but only because it follows specific routes controlled by specific relay stations. If anyone tried to develop independent FTL to travel freely without the network, these equations would make it look impossible. He turned to face the council. Someone locked the galaxy in a cage and then convinced everyone that the cage was the sky. The chamber exploded into noise, hundreds of species shouting, signaling, vibrating. With alarm, Joel KTH slammed his staff against the floor, calling for order. Murakami waited for the noise to die. Then he put his solution on the screen. This is free FTL, he said simply. Unlimited, no hyperlanes, no relays, no network. Any species can build it with resources they already have. I developed it from fragments of your own technology that crashed on our world. He looked directly at Zulkith. I'm giving it away to everyone for free. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a world changing. Every species in that chamber understood what free FTL meant. It meant the Veldroth hegemony's control of the hyperlane network. The foundation of their power for 2,000 years was over. Joel KTH's yellow eyes burned with something that was no longer contempt. It was fear. He activated a signal on his throne deep in the station. Hegemony warships began to move. Murakami looked at the two empty seats where Vasquez and Akafor should have been, and then he looked at the stars beyond the chamber walls, and he said quietly to himself, now it begins. They came for them in the dark. 6 hours after Murakami's revelation, after the council chamber had erupted into chaos in Jal, KTH had suspended all proceedings for the safety and stability of the Union. Veldry soldiers stormed the human quarters. They did not knock. They did not explain. They came in with weapons drawn and faces that said everything words did not need to. Akafor was standing when they entered. He had been standing for the past 4 hours, ever since the door to their quarters had locked from the outside, and the station's communication systems had gone silent. He had known this was coming. He had positioned himself between the door and the others, and when the soldiers burst in, he did not move. He stood like a wall and let them see his eyes. And what they saw in those eyes made the lead soldier hesitate for just half a second. That hesitation told Akafor everything. They were not confident. They had been ordered to do this, but they did not want to. Somewhere in the chain of command, doubt had already begun to spread. On your knees, the lead soldier ordered. No, said Akafor. The soldier struck him across the face with an armored fist. Akafor's head snapped to the side. Blood ran from his lip. He turned his head back slowly and looked at the soldier again. He did not kneel. "You will comply," the soldier said, and there was something new in his voice, not anger, something closer to confusion. In the soldier's entire career, when he told a prisoner to kneel, the prisoner knelt. Every species did. It was the natural order of things. The strong commanded, the weak obeyed. "I said no," HFY repeated. His voice was calm, steady, and completely without fear. "They forced him to the ground eventually. It took 4 of them, and even then, he did not make it easy." Vasquez and Murakami were restrained as well, though neither of them resisted physically. Vasquez, because she knew her fight would come later and in a different form. Murakami, because he had already done what he came to do. They were separated and taken to different holding cells deep in the station's core. HFY's cell was a metal box designed for species far larger and stronger than humans. The walls were 3 ft thick. The door was sealed with magnetic locks that could hold a creature weighing 10 tons. There was no furniture, no light source, just a dim glow from the ceiling that never changed. He sat in the corner and began to think. He did not think about escape. Not yet. He thought about patrol patterns. He listened to the rhythm of footsteps outside his door. He counted the seconds between guard rotations. He noted when the magnetic locks pulsed, and when they were silent. He filed every piece of information away in the organized, patient architecture of a mind that had been trained to find weakness in any system. Then he began to exercise, push-ups, sit-ups, stretches. He had no idea how long he would be here, and he knew that a body left idle was a weapon left to rust. 2 levels above him, Vasquez was in a cell that was slightly more comfortable. It had a bench and a light that she could dim. Her captors had clearly decided that the diplomat was less dangerous than the soldier. This was a mistake that Vasquez intended to exploit fully. Her first guard was a young Veldre, smaller than the soldiers, probably low-ranking, with scales that still had the bright green color of youth. He brought her food that she could not eat and water that tasted like metal, and he placed them inside the cell without looking at her. "What's your name?" Vasquez asked. Guard said nothing. "You don't have to tell me. I'm just making conversation. It gets quiet in here." The guard left. He came back 6 hours later with more food. Vasquez asked again. He said nothing. She did not push. On his third visit, she changed tactics. "You know," she said casually, "in the trial today I noticed something about the way the junior species react when Joel Keth speaks. They don't look at him with respect. They look at him the way my people look at a storm. You can't stop it, so you just wait for it to pass." Guard's hands paused for just a moment. "I've seen that look before," Vasquez continued, "on a 100 different worlds. Well, one world, but in 100 different places. It's the look of people who are controlled but not convinced, people who obey because the cost of disobedience is too high, not because they believe in the one giving orders." The guard left quickly, but the next time he came, he lingered for 3 seconds longer than he needed to. By the 5th visit he spoke. He said only one word, his name. But one word was all Vasquez needed. One word was a crack in the wall, and she had spent her life turning cracks into doorways. Over the next 2 days, she learned more from that young guard than the coalition's intelligence service had gathered in 5 years. She learned that the Veldrathi hegemony maintained its power not through loyalty but through fear. She learned that more than 100 junior species in the Union chafed under hegemony control, paying tribute in, following laws they had no voice in, creating. She learned that the celery, the gentle glowing beings who had wished the humans well in the council chamber, had been quietly building a network of sympathetic species for decades, waiting for a moment to act. She learned that the moment was now and that the humans had created it. Vasquez began sending messages not electronically. The cell had no communications equipment. She sent them through people, a word to the young guard, a question to the technician who came to check the cell systems, a compliment to the Irani worker who cleaned the quarter outside, spoken in the Iran's own chemical language, a few phrases that Vasquez had memorized from intercepted files. Each message was small, harmless on its own, but together they formed a web that spread outward through the station like roots through soil. 3 levels below, in the deepest part of the station, Murakami was in a cell that had nothing. No bench, no light control, no tools. They had taken his data pad, his notebooks, even the pen from his pocket. The cell was bare metal and silence. For the first hour, Murakami sat in the dark and felt afraid. He was not a soldier. He was not a diplomat. He was a man who had spent his life in laboratories and classrooms, and the reality of imprisonment, real physical hopeless imprisonment, pressed against his mind like a vice. Then the fear passed. Way a wave passes over a rock, and what was left was clarity. He still had his mind. They could not take that. He stood and walked to the nearest wall. Ari bit the inside of his cheek until blood flowed, and he dipped his finger in it. And he began to write. The equations came from memory, every symbol, every variable, every proof, the complete solution to the Keldon paradox written in human blood on an alien wall. He worked for hours, his finger tracing red lines across the metal, covering one wall and then moving to the next. When his cheek stopped bleeding, he bit it. Again, the pain was sharp and constant. But he did not stop. A salary scientist named Athera had been assigned to observe the human prisoners and report on their behavior. She was a researcher, not a jailer, soft-spoken and curious, and deeply uncomfortable with what the hegemony was doing. When she arrived at Murakami's cell and looked through the observation window, she stopped, breathing. Every wall was covered, floor to ceiling, corner to corner. The cell was a canvas of equations written in red, the most important scientific breakthrough in 3 centuries, preserved in the blood of the man who had created it. Murakami was sitting in the center of the cell, his hands red, his face calm. He looked up at the observation window and spoke. Can you read it? Athera could. She was one of the Union's foremost physicists, and she recognized the equations immediately. Her bioluminescent body flickered rapidly, the salary equivalent of a racing heartbeat. This is the complete solution, she whispered. Copy it, Murakami said, every line, and give it to someone who will share it, not the hegemony, not the council, everyone. Athera looked at the blood-covered walls. She looked at the thin, quiet human sitting in the middle of a prison cell, and she felt something shift inside her, something ancient and powerful and impossible to name. It was the feeling of watching someone refuse to be defeated even when they had lost Everything, she copied the equations. Within 12 hours, Murakami's work was transmitted to 17 species through salary. Back channels, within 24 hours it had reached 50. The galaxy was waking up and the hegemony could not stop it. On the surface of the crisis, things were worse. The Beldrati hegemony moved to invoke the cleansing mandate, an ancient protocol that authorized the complete sterilization of a species deemed an existential threat to the Union. It had been used only twice before, both times against species that no longer existed. The vote was scheduled for 48 hours from now. Back on Earth, the United Earth Coalition detected the hegemony fleet moving into attack formation around the quarantine boundary, 300 warships each, one capable of burning a continent to glass. Director Singh stood in the command center in Geneva and made the second hardest decision of her life. The hardest had been sending 3 people alone into the dark. This one was simpler. She authorized the broadcast. Every transmitter on Earth, every satellite, every deep space relay, they all activated at the same time and sent a single continuous signal on every frequency the galaxy used. It was not a weapon, it was not a threat, it was a story, the story of humanity. Uncensored, unedited, complete. The broadcast contained everything. The wars, the plagues, the genocides, the slavery, the cruelty, every dark and terrible chapter of human history are played out in images and data for every world in the galaxy to see, and woven through the darkness like threads of gold through black cloth were the other things, the art, the music, the medicine, the hands reaching out to pull strangers from rubble, the soldiers who carried children through fire, the scientists who cured diseases that had killed millions, the ordinary people who chose love over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, hope over despair, again and again across 10,000 years of suffering. It was the most honest thing any species had ever broadcast. It hid nothing, it apologized for nothing. It simply said, this is what we are. Across the galaxy, worlds went silent as they watched, why species that had never heard of Earth sat before their screens and saw a civilization that had torn itself apart and stitched itself back together so many times that the scars had become part of its identity. They saw a species that was capable of unimaginable violence and unimaginable tenderness, often in the same breath. The Irani collective processed the broadcast and for the first time in its 3,000-year history could not reach consensus. The hive mind fractured into factions. Some wanted to destroy humanity before it grew stronger, and some wanted to ally with it before anyone else did. The fact that a single species could divide an undividable mind was in itself unprecedented. The salary watched the broadcast and wept their luminous tears and said, they are like us, they are broken and beautiful, and they never stop trying. Even some Beldre in the privacy of their quarters watched the broadcast and felt something they could not name stir in their ancient cold hearts. In his cell, Akafor heard a change in the rhythm of the station. The footsteps outside his door became faster, more urgent. The guard rotation shortened. Something was happening, something big. And the hegemony was rattled. He stood, stretched his bruised body, and waited. Hours later, the magnetic locks on his door pulsed in an unfamiliar pattern. Then the door opened and High Arbiter Joel Keth stepped inside. He was alone, which meant he was either very brave or Very desperate, probably both. The old Veldro looked at Akefer for a long moment, then he spoke. Your species could still survive this. I am offering you a path when the three of you will recant your statement. The physicists' research will be destroyed. Earth will remain in quarantine, but it will remain. Your people will live on your terms, Akefer said, on the only terms that have ever mattered, the strong said. The terms the weak accept them. This is the natural order. Akefer looked at the ancient alien standing before him, being who had ruled a galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. He looked at the power in those yellow eyes and the certainty that radiated from every scale, and he smiled. You've never met a species that would rather die than kneel, have you? Joel Keth stared at him for the first time in a very long life. The High Arbiter did not have an answer. He turned and left without another word, and the door sealed shut behind him. Akefer sat back down in the dark, and he waited. The rebellion started quietly, the way all real revolutions do, not with a roar but with a whisper, passed from hand to hand in the dark. Vasquez's network activated at exactly the same moment across 12 different sections of Eth's prime junior species. Representatives who had been silent for decades suddenly filed formal demands with the Council's administrative core. 12 species speaking as one invoked an ancient law that even the hegemony could not ignore: the right of universal witness. The law was older than the hegemony's reign. It predated Joel Keth's bloodline by 1,000 years. It stated that any proceeding involving the fate of a species must be broadcast in its entirety to every world in the Galactic Union. No closed doors, no secret votes, no shadows to hide in, and the hegemony had used darkness as a weapon for centuries. Species vanished, and the galaxy never knew the truth. Votes were held in sealed chambers, and the results were delivered as decisions already made. The right of universal witness was supposed to be a relic, an old law that no one ever used because no one was brave enough. 12 species used it now, and the moment they did, the hegemony's plan to quietly eliminate humanity collapsed. Joel Keth received the news in his private chambers. He stood perfectly still for a long time, his ancient yellow eyes fixed on something that no one else could see. Then he gave the order: convene the full council. He had no choice. Refusing a universal witness invocation would expose the hegemony's manipulation to every world in the Union more effectively than any trial ever could. But he also gave another order, quieter, to the captain of his personal guard, an order concerning the 3 human prisoners. Akefer heard them coming. He had been counting the seconds between guard rotations for 3 days, and the pattern had just broken. Heavy footsteps, moving fast, too many of them. This was not a rotation, this was a kill team. He stood in the center of his cell and breathed. The door opened. 3 Beldrai special soldiers entered. Not the regular guards, but the hegemony elites, each one wearing power-enhanced armor that tripled their strength. They carried no restraints. They had not come to arrest him. The first soldier swung at Akefer's head. Akefer ducked under the blow, grabbed the soldier's armored wrist, and used the creature's own momentum to slam it into the wall. Impact cracked the metal plating. Before the second soldier could react, Akefer drove his elbow into the gap between the chest plate and the helmet, a spot he had identified days ago by watching the guards move. The soldier went down. Choking, the third soldier was faster. It caught across the ribs and he felt something crack. Pain exploded through his torso. He stumbled, rolled, and came up with a piece of broken armor plating in his hand, a jagged edge of metal pulled from the first soldier's wrist. Guard, he held it like a knife, and the remaining soldier looked at him, and for one moment the alien saw something that it would remember for the rest of its life. The human was bleeding, broken, and outmatched, and his eyes were absolutely calm. There was no fear in them. There was no rage. There was only a cold, clear calculation that said, I have been hurt before. I have been hurt worse. I will not stop. The soldier hesitated. That was when the door behind it opened and a salary operative stepped through. Yara, the scientist who had copied Murakami's equations from the walls of his cell, had not acted alone. The salary had been preparing for this moment for longer than anyone knew. Their operatives were embedded throughout the station's support systems, quiet and unnoticed, the way the salary had always been too gentle for anyone to consider a threat. That was the hegemony's second great mistake. About the species they ruled, the first had been about humans, the second was about the allies humans had inspired. Ethara was accompanied by 4 others. Celery, and to Akefer's surprise, the young Grathi guard who had been watching. Vasquez, certain the one who had told her his name, he stood in the doorway, with his weapon drawn, pointing it not at the human but at his own countrymen. Commander Akafortha said in her soft, musical voice, Ambassador Vasquez sends her regards. The council session has been called. We need to secure the chamber. Akeper looked at the young Veldra guard. You sure about this, son? The guard's scales rippled with color. Fear, determination, something new that he could not name. The ambassador said something to me, he replied. She said that choosing to be free is harder than being told what to do. She said that's what makes it worth choosing. Akeper nodded. He pressed his hand against his broken ribs, grimaced, and straightened up. Then let's move. They freed Vasquez first. When she walked out of her cell, looking like she had just woken up from a nap, not spent 3 days in a prison, her hair was pulled back, her eyes were sharp, and she was already thinking 4 moves ahead. Broadcast worked, she told Akefer as they moved through the corridors. Earth's transmission hit every world in the Union. The Irani can't agree on what to do with us. Their hive mind actually split for the first time in history. 57 species have sent formal protest against the cleansing mandate, and the salary have been transmitting Murakami's equations to anyone who will listen. How many have them? Over 100 species last count. The information is free. You can't unring a bell. They reach Makami's cell last when they opened the door. The salary operatives who had not seen it before stopped and stared. Every surface of the cell was covered in equations written in dried blood. Walls, floor, even parts of the ceiling that Murakami had reached by jumping. The thin physicist was sitting cross-legged in the center of it all, looking like a monk in a temple made of mathematics. He looked up when the door opened. Is it time? It's time, said Vasquez. He stood, wobbled slightly, and steadied himself. He had not eaten properly in days, and the blood loss had left him pale and weak, but his eyes were clear. I'll need a display terminal for the equations, he said. Already arranged. Ira replied. They moved through the Station as a group, 3 humans, a handful of salary, and 1 young grothy guard who had chosen his conscience over his orders. They met resistance twice. Both times Akafor handled it, he fought like nothing the aliens had ever seen. Not with the brute power of a Veldrai or the speed of a Catharan, but with something far more dangerous. He adapted in real time, treating every fight like a puzzle, finding the solution in seconds and executing it with a precision that was almost beautiful in its violence. They reached the Grand Council chamber just as the session was being called to order. The doors were sealed, but the celery had operatives in the station's control systems, and the locks disengaged with a soft click. Doors opened, and 3 battered, bloodied humans walked into the center of the most powerful assembly in the galaxy. The chamber was full, every seat occupied, every holographic screen active, broadcasting to every world in the Union in real time. It trillions of beings across thousands of planets were watching. The right of universal witness meant that nothing that happened in this room could be hidden. Joel Keth sat on his throne, and when he saw the humans enter, something moved across his ancient face. Not surprise, not anger, but the cold recognition of a player who has been outmaneuvered and knows it. Murakami went first. He walked to the central display terminal and brought up his equations, not the partial version he had shown before, but the complete solution, every line, every proof. He presented it without drama, without flourish. He laid it out the way builder lays a foundation, solid, precise, and meant to last. This is free, faster than light travel, he said. It requires no hyperlane network, no relay stations, no central control. Any species with basic industrial capability can build it. I am giving it to the galaxy, not to the Union, not to the hegemony, to every species, everywhere, without conditions. He paused and looked up at the thousands of alien faces watching him. On my world there is an old story about a creature that stole fire from the gods and gave it to the people. The gods punished him for it. They chained him to a rock and let birds tear at his flesh for eternity. He knew the punishment was coming, and he gave the fire anyway because he believed that knowledge should never be locked away. He touched the display gently with his blood-stained fingers. I don't know if you'll punish me for this, but the fire is already out there. It belongs to everyone now. He stepped back and Vasquez stepped forward. She looked different from how she had appeared during the trial of voice. In that trial she had been polished, controlled, every word measured. Now she was bruised. Her wrists were raw from restraints, her clothes were torn, and she was more powerful than she had ever been because she was no longer performing. She was speaking from the place where words come from when everything else has been stripped away. I'm not going to argue for humanity's inclusion in the Union, she said. That was what we came here to do, and it's not enough anymore. She turned slowly, addressing every section of the chamber. Look at what happened in the last 3 days. We passed your trials, all 3 of them. We showed you endurance and mercy and empathy and brilliance, and in return we were arrested. We were locked in cells. No, a vote was scheduled to exterminate our species, not because we failed, because we succeeded too well, because we showed you something that the hegemony cannot afford for you to see. Her voice rose, not in anger but in clarity, that the system is broken, that the Union is not a partnership, It is a hierarchy built on control. The hyperlanes are chains, the trials are filters, the cleansing mandate is a weapon pointed at anyone who dares to be different. You have lived under this system for so long that most of you have forgotten what freedom looks like. She pointed at the display where Murakami's equation still glowed. That is what freedom looks like, the ability to go anywhere without asking permission. And here is the truth that the hegemony does not want you to hear. You don't need us to be free. You never did. All you needed was for someone to stand in this chamber and say it out loud. She lowered her hand. Humanity is not asking for a seat at your table. We are building a new table, and every species in this galaxy is invited to sit, whether the hegemony approves or not. The chamber was absolutely silent. Then the salary representative, the same one who had wished them well on the first day, stood and began to glow. Its entire body lit up like a star, casting soft blue light across the chamber. It was the salary gesture of ultimate respect. One by one, other salary joined, rising from their seats and shining until their entire section of the chamber blazed with light. Then the Torshi stood, species whose 300-year conflict Vasquez had resolved in 40 minutes, rose as one and struck their crystalline bodies together, filling the chamber with a sound like 1,000 bells. Then the then species whose names the humans did not even know, they rose in waves. Not all of them, not even most, but enough to be seen, enough to be heard, enough to change the direction of a 4,000-year-old civilization. The vote was called. It was decisive. Over 600 species voted to admit humanity to the Galactic Union. Over 500 voted to reform the Union's governance, to dismantle the hegemony's monopoly on the hyperlane network, and to permanently abolish the cleansing mandate. Zalkuth sat on his throne as the votes were tallied, and he watched his empire unravel with the quiet stillness of a mountain that has begun to crumble. When the final tally was announced, he did not rage, he did not threaten. He simply sat an ancient and diminished and looked down at the three small beings who had done what no species in galactic history had ever done before. He spoke one last time, and his voice was soft enough that only Vasquez, standing closest to his throne, could hear him. What are you? She looked up at him, bruised and exhausted and unbroken, and she said, we're human. We break, we bleed, we fail. And then we get back up every single time. Joel Keith closed his eyes. When he opened them, the three humans were walking out of the chamber, surrounded by light and noise and the sounds of a galaxy being reborn. 5 years later, the galaxy was a different place. New FTL routes had opened sectors of space that no species had ever explored. Worlds that had been isolated for centuries were connected. Trade flourished. Conflict still happened. Humanity had not brought utopia, and they never claimed they would, but the galaxy was alive in a way it had not been for millennia. Species that had been voiceless now spoke. Species that had been controlled now chose their own paths. On Ethos Prime, at the entrance to the Grand Council chamber, a statue had been erected. It showed three human figures standing shoulder to shoulder: a soldier, a diplomat, and a scientist. They were small compared to the statues of the alien heroes that lined the rest of the corridor, but visitors always stopped at that one, the longest, Akefer, Retired to a farm on Mars, he grew things in the red soil and taught his neighbors' children how to build shelters. He never spoke about the trials. Vasquez became the first human ambassador to the reformed Galactic Council. She spent the next 20 years building bridges between species that had never spoken to each other before. She was very good at it. Murakami returned to his basement laboratory in Kyoto. He had new equations to write. The galaxy, he had decided, was much larger than anyone realized. And there were doors that even free FTL had not yet opened. In the archives of the Galactic Union, an alien historian and Irani scholar who had witnessed the events firsthand recorded a final entry about the species called human. The entry was short because the Irani valued efficiency above all things, and because some truths do not require many words. The entry read, "They sent just 3, and the galaxy was never the